Thank you, everyone. I can't even begin to express how excited I am to speak at LoopConf. I get the pleasure to speak at a lot of conferences with my role at Pantheon, but LoopConf is one of the groups of people that are a lot of just awesome people who can do some really great stuff, so I'm excited to be here. So just kind of raise of hands, how many of you know what continuous integration is? A lot of you. How many of you are actually using it? Not as many of you. Good to know. So I want to break apart, I think kind of stepping back a little bit, when I first joined Pantheon, I had no idea what it was, not a clue. I didn't know what those words meant. I had no idea what it all involved. And it was something that I was tasked with learning when I started in my job. I know that we all can relate to the fact that we've struggled with imposter syndrome and having to learn things that we don't necessarily know. And when I first started looking, I actually watched a build that was going, and I freaked out. I was like, there's no way I'm going to figure out what this is doing. I can't even read that. What is that? And now, a year later, but it was about 6 months later that I actually felt very comfortable working with it and even teaching other people how to do it. And it was exciting. It was this very just exciting, awesome accomplishment. So I'm here to help all of you get to that point. So after the talk, if you have questions, if you want to chat, let me know, because that's what I'm here to do, is help. So before we dig into some of the other stuff, I want to break apart the two words. So integration is really the act of integrating things together, right? So if we all have websites, I'm guessing every single one of us in this room has a website. We've used PHP, we've used JavaScript, we've used CSS, and we've gotten all of them to work together in our website. And that's integration. So we're all already halfway there. I remember the first time that I dug into WordPress. So I started in Joomla. No shaming me. I started in Joomla and decided I was going to dig into WordPress. So I spun up WordPress. I found a theme in the directory. I installed the theme. I activated it. And before you know it, I had this white screen. And I was like, what did I do? How can I break something so quickly? And it took me a while to realize that it was the integration of that theme with my WordPress install that was they're not melding together. My puzzle pieces do not fit. Obviously, had to go through, figure out how to take apart that puzzle and actually make that work. So continuous is, we all know the definition of continuous, something that loops through and continuously is functioning and working in a way that it should. My site was not functioning and working in a way that it should, and definitely not continuously. So I want to actually talk about why this is so important for teams. So we're going to look at kind of a team dynamic and how they can dig into this stuff. So all of us have been in different phases of our careers, depending if you're a new developer, if you've been a developer for 10 years, whatever stage you're in, you've been and can relate to all of these stages. So this is Rachel. Rachel starts a new agency, and she's using FTP. That's what she knows, and she's working alone. So she's just chugging along, she's getting all of her sites integrated, and she's using FTP to get them there. Rachel starts to get busy, and she brings on Dustin. So Dustin joins the team, and Dustin is working on a CSS file that Rachel needs to make changes to. I think we all can envision what's going to happen next. Rachel tries to download the file, Dustin made changes, her file is not the latest file, she overwrites Dustin's changes. They decide that it's time to use some version control. So they integrate GitHub. They start to use GitHub to ensure that their projects have version control and nobody is overwriting anyone's files. They bring in Alexis. Alexis is from an agency that has already been using SAS, they've already been using Gulp, they're using lots of awesome tasks to get some of their stuff done, and Alexa says, hey, this is something we should be doing. So the team starts to implement this. They bring in David. David joins the team, and David is a stickler for processes. So David decides, we should really be writing up how we're building out new projects. How do we create new projects? How do we actually get them deployed? What are the processes behind all of this? So David creates an internal wiki to get all of this stuff done. They bring on Lizzie, and with Lizzie joining the team, they realize that there are 5 developers on their team. They can start to divide and conquer. So they end up dividing into different groups. So one group is 3 sets of developers, the other group is 2, and they're working on different projects at different times. Because they're split, they've decided we need some communication across teams because we don't know what one team is doing and what the other team is doing. So they bring in Slack, and they start using Slack as their internal communication. They also got a really big project. And so when this really big project came in, it meant a lot of immediate work, but it meant a lot of continual work. So they brought in a new full-time employee as well as a new contractor. I'm one slide ahead. And so when they did that, they brought in a contractor, and they don't know this contractor. Anytime we bring in contractors, if we've never worked with them, we have no idea how they write code, how they work, what is the level of trust. And so they decided that at that point, they needed to start doing code reviews. And they did these code reviews through GitHub's like regular just pull request. And then they decided that they needed to bring in a contractor again, but this person was going to do QA. Up until that point, they basically had just been doing QA internally, just kind of review, are my functionality working, with no actual process. So they brought someone in who does all of their QA. So now Rachel has this fully functioning team, and they're doing all of this awesome stuff. So if we step away from Rachel, we're going to talk about continuous integration a little bit. This quote is by far, if you get anything out of this talk, this is what you should remember. There's no single continuous integration and continuous delivery that will work for everyone. You're essentially trying to automate your company's culture using bash scripts. If I would have heard this when I first started digging into CI, I could have been like, I can start with bash scripts. That's not scary. So if we talk about some of the things that we all do every single day, we all write some code, we all compile some Sass, we minify some JavaScript, we do some code reviews for our peers, maybe we do some internal testing of our own, maybe we send off to a QA team, we deploy to staging servers, I feel like we do that a lot, communication with team, and following procedures. So all of these things that we're doing, Rachel's team was doing, and I wanted to bold out communicate with your team. I feel like as developers, we're not super great at that. Communicating with your team is super important to make sure you're all on the same page, make sure you're all functioning correctly, and just make sure everyone knows what's going on. So keeping these daily tasks in mind, we're going to dig more into continuous integration and why it's important with these daily tasks. So this is a very long definition, but it's really good. So continuous integration is a development practice that requires developers to integrate code into a shared repository several times a day. I can tell you right now that agency work I did before Pantheon, I would go days before I committed code. I know that's not probably the best way to do it, but I would go days if I was working on a feature that I was the only one responsible for. The whole point of CI is to really get your team to communicate better and to be all on the same page and to do that very efficiently. And if I'm waiting days to commit code, there's no way that anyone else on my team can test any of that code or they can try to configure anything that they're building with that new code. So doing it several times a day is important. And then each check-in is then verified by an automated build, allowing teams to detect problems early. And by integrating regularly, you can detect errors quickly and locate them more easily. So lots of words there. But to kind of summarize, if you're committing your code more often, and we're letting this automated build check for errors, we can find those errors quickly, we can solve them even the same day, instead of having to wait for them to be committed days later and have to try to get integrated with other developers' codes. So looking back at Rachel's team, she's doing a lot of these great things. There are a lot of things here that I think that we can automate, like the Slack message. Right now, when they're building new projects, they're manually sending a Slack message. Let's automate that. Let's save all of them a lot of time. So let's automate all of the things. So when I first started digging into CI, I've already told you I was scared, and I can totally admit that. It seemed like something that I was not going to be able to do. And it turns out I couldn't do it for a while because I failed a lot. And this was actually right before the first time that I gave this talk. I gave this talk about 6 months ago for the first time at WordCamp for Publishers. And I decided right before my talk, because this is a super great idea, that I was going to tweak my actual repository, that I was going to live demo and change some code. Not a good idea. Clearly, I failed for a while. And Dwayne, one of my coworkers, was sitting next to me, and he can totally witness the, S word, what did I do? Like, why did I get myself into this? Now I broke it. But I want to point out that the master has failed more times than the beginner has even tried. Without trying this stuff, you're not going to figure it out. You're going to fail, and you might fail for a while before you figure it out. But you can see I did get success at the end. So kind of talk through, so this example repository, I'm not going to dig into the code because just like that script said, your CI process is really like your company's culture. It's writing your company's culture in a bash script, and I don't know your company's culture. I do have some examples you can definitely look at, but I'm just going to talk about general. So in the example that I had and that we use at Pantheon, actually Andrew Taylor, one of my coworkers, started creating, and it's awesome. I'm just going to talk through some of that build step. So in those build steps, we're going to set up our containers. So we've got a lot of different solutions we can use. So in these examples, I'm using Circle CI. There's also Travis CI. If you like jumping off of boats, you can try Jenkins. I'm glad that you all laughed about that. So in the beginning, what you're going to do is that whatever tool that you decide to use, they're going to basically be the place that's going to spin up your site, do all of the testing, all of the things that you have set up, and then it's going to do whatever processes you tell it. So it could deploy it to somewhere or whatever it is that you decide you want to do. So when you do that, it's going to set up your containers. Your containers are going to be whatever it is that you say that you want. So in this case, it's PHP. Maybe you need a SQL database. You want to actually install WordPress and see if everything's functioning. Whatever that looks like, you set all of that up in your containers. Then you're going to install your dependencies. In this case, it's using Composer. It's grabbing the plugins that it needs. It's grabbing the themes that it needs. And it's actually installing all of that stuff right into those containers. Then we can set up some task runners. So instead of having to compile SAS and then actually commit compiled SAS, and you get version issues with other developers, they've got different versions, they've compiled it differently, whatever that looks like, you don't have to worry about that. We can actually just commit the SAS file and allow our CI build to compile that SAS and minify and do whatever else we want it to do right in that build. We can run some automated tests. This is probably the best part about it, is being able to test and make sure that your code is actually functioning and doing the things that you want it to be doing. One of those is Behat. So I've got a couple different tests in here. The first one I have is Behat. If you're not familiar with Behat, one of my coworkers named Steve Persh has an awesome talk that he's done. I know it's on a lot of Drupal conference or maybe YouTube. Behat is great, and when I first started digging into Behat, I actually look at it as like an alternative to a QA testing. Of course, we still need a full-blown QA, but Behat is really great at checking functionality. So you could say, hey, if you go to my homepage, you should expect to see a hero with this content, a form with these fields, and when you submit these fields, you should get this kind of response back. So it's a really great way to make sure that whatever code that you're committing is actually functioning in the way that you want it to function. Coding standards, of course, we always want to be doing our best work. You can put in some coding standards, testing. And then visual regression. There was actually a workshop here on Wednesday. Raise your hand if you took the workshop. Awesome, so a good number of you. You were all in that workshop, or the ones that raised your hand were in that workshop, doing some automated updates with WordPress using visual regression. Super great tool. And if you didn't catch that content, you'll have to try to grab some of the slides. It was really good. But visual regression allows you to basically compare two different environments. So you can say, hey, here's my live environment. Here's my new dev environment. I've updated things. I've made some changes. Can we just make sure that these look exactly the same and there's no major errors? And that's a really great tool to be able to use. And then maybe at the end, we're going to deploy to a staging or some type of a test server to be able to actually see the code that we just built out. And all of that's going to happen without us even touching it. We basically commit our code. We walk away. We can get a coffee. We can take a walk. We don't have to do any of these things. We can let all of the robots do these things. So just a little more definitions here. So continuous delivery, we get to that endpoint where we do some type of committing code to a server. Continuous delivery is actually the act of delivering that code. So at the end of it, we've got some type of deployment, and it's delivering that to whatever environment that might be. And then continuous deployment is the actual act of deploying that out. So we say, hey, this is ready to go. We've done all of our checking. Maybe one of your builds is actually like to production. Maybe that's your final step after a code review has been done, and you've decided, yep, this is good to go. Let's go ahead and push that out. That's continuous deployment. All right, so if you're not doing CI and you want to be, I want to give you a list of things or bullet points that you can actually walk away with at things that you can tangibly do. So the first one is write down the steps to create a new project. Like David did in Rachel's team, he created that internal processes doc. He actually wrote down everything that it took for that project to be created. What does it take for your team to create a project? And be very granular, because you would be surprised by the tiny little things that you can actually include and automate and stop wasting time on those things. Highlight any problem areas. If there are any areas that are inside of your processes that just don't make a lot of sense, or maybe you feel like every time you do it, you're like, this just isn't right. I don't know what the solution is, but this doesn't feel right. Highlight those problem areas. And then automate at least one of the items from step one. So whatever it is you might be doing, maybe you're manually sending Slack messages when you create a new project. Maybe when you build out a new environment, you're manually sending a Slack message. Automate that. Just take one simple thing and start to automate it. And then the last bullet point is going to be a lot harder, but try to automate at least one of those problem areas. So when you try to automate a problem area, it will require you to actually dig into that problem a little bit deeper. Why is it a problem? What is it that I'm doing? Does this still feel weird? How can I do this better? And if you can start to automate and get through those problem areas, then you either A, can find better processes, or B, kind of get rid of those problems in general. So I wanted to share this. I don't know what happened. Keynote is just like, goodbye. All right, so in a minute I'll share. Okay, so this is a repository, like I said, that my coworker at Pantheon built. It was actually a repository that I started to look through when I was digging in and trying to learn. All of the actual deployments are built out for Pantheon, but you can definitely start looking at this and decipher some of the code to be able to figure out, like, okay, cool, this is how I get started with Behat, or this is how I can compile some Sass, or whatever that might look like, and it's all built for Circle CI. Computer malfunctions. All right, there's also a bit.ly link if you wanted to get a link direct to that repository. So it's just the bit.ly CI-example. I'm Tessa K22 on basically all the socials if you'd like to chat or follow me or whatever. And if you want to talk, you can schedule some time with me through Calendly.
I think we got time for a couple of questions. If anybody has questions, oh, look at the hands. Okay.
This is the best part. Throw me off my memorized game.
So on your final build process, if you were to do that manually, how much time do you think that's saving with the CI integration?
Oh, a lot.
Like 80%?
I'd say at least 80%, yeah. I mean, at least when it comes to like getting to the end where you're like, I'm going to compile, like once that you have your code done and you're like doing those steps, like I'd say it's huge.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the talk.
Thank you.
One of the challenges we've faced as we've integrated continuous integration into our processes is that the testing process and the time to spin up a site to run those tests increases the time to get feedback back to the developers for if something fails. How do you balance out the need to automate all the things and also the need to get feedback as quickly as possible?
Yeah, I think the upside of automating all the things is that can be a part of your automation. If there is someone that you know is receiving this, maybe it's a QA team, maybe it's the same type of project management team, that can be a part of your process. You can actually do some type of like, let's send them an email and say, hey, here's the link to the build that I just did. or, here's the Slack message to whatever it is that I'm working on. I would say if they're external, obviously that makes it a little bit trickier. But the nice thing is that if we can automate some of the stuff that takes us all this time to do all of these things, at least at the end of the day, when we have all that stuff ready, we can set up processes around like, how do we get that sent out to a client? And maybe that's the actual client side team that's responsible for doing those. What can we do to make sure we get that information to them so they can do that?
Hello. So I haven't set it up, but I've seen when things go wrong. So why does Jenkins make you want to jump off a boat into, I'm assuming, frigidly cold, terrible waters?
It's usually frigidly cold, yeah. So before I came to Pantheon, I actually worked at General Mills. So General Mills being huge, huge company, they used Jenkins for everything that they were doing. And Jenkins can be insanely powerful and awesome. The problem is that with Jenkins, you're like starting from nothing. It's basically like saying, okay, I'm gonna use WordPress or I'm gonna build my own CMS. So using Jenkins, I feel like I'm like, cool, I'm gonna build my own CMS. Using like Circle CI or Travis, I'm like, cool, I'm gonna take WordPress and have a start state. It's powerful, but it's very blank. And you have to do a lot of configuration to get it to where you want it to be. And it was a nightmare at General Mills.
Tessa, that was great, thank you.
Yeah.
How do you try and get buy-in from a manager to set these things up, to spend the time initially to say, this is going to save us time in the future, but how do you get the managers, how do you explain it to bosses or managers who don't get this?
Right. I think that's a hard conversation. I think in general, especially if you're in agency life, it's usually quick. We need to work on projects. We need to be spending our time on billable hours. I think maybe putting some research into it, and whether that be you take an hour and you say, hey, what are our processes internally? Okay, so we're doing these 5 things. How can we automate these things? Approximately how long will it take me to possibly dig into that? And just give them the numbers, especially anyone who's in management or anyone who's has anything to do with finance. They like numbers. So if you say, this is going to take me, 40 hours to set up, but in the long run, over the next 6 months, it's going to save us 500 hours or whatever that might be. Those numbers are obvious. It's very obvious to say, okay, cool, let's put the time in now so that we can save the time later.
Thank you. That was a great talk. My question is around deployment. So I know Pantheon has some fantastic tools for deployment, etc. But if your environment is something else, what are some of the common or recommended ways to actually do deployments to your staging or production servers from Circle CI or continuous integration?
That's a loaded question. I think that really depends on like really you can deploy anywhere, right? Because it's a bash script at the end of the day that you're saying, hey, let's do something. So you could deploy out to any type of hosting that you have, whether that be a managed host or whether that be a non-managed host. It's DigitalOcean, it's AWS, whatever that looks like. I'd say that, that's kind of a tricky question because it just kind of depends. It might be a really good way to actually kind of like step back and think about what that looks like. Like how many different environments do you have? Do you need a, kind of a development environment? Do you need a QA environment? Like how many environments do you need and what is going to be the time to actually set all of those up? And what that looks like to set those up. So if you're setting those up through a dashboard, that's gonna be a little bit trickier to have to kind of integrate into CI because you're gonna have to figure out like, is there like a CLI for this? Like, can I do something that's going to be through command line versus a dashboard? So yeah, you really have to kind of think about whatever your hosting is before you can dig into that.
Anybody else? All right, thank you, Tessa.
Awesome, thank you.